Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. This is the series where I just chat about the last 10 books that I read. I like to just take a moment to reflect on what I've read, keep kind of a reading log of what I've read. My usual disclaimer for these videos is that these are my subjective opinions on what I was reading. These videos are not meant to tell you which books I think are valuable to society and culture and literature and which books are not, or even to tell you which books you should read or shouldn't read, and certainly not to tell you which books you should enjoy and not enjoy. I'm trying to push back against what I see in the online book reviewing community, which is this culture of, rather than embrace the beauty of coexisting different opinions on books, that instead we kind of just label books as good or bad, sometimes based on not even having read the book. I don't want you guys to think that I am some kind of all-knowing literary judge. I certainly am not, and I am not making these videos because I think of myself that way, nor do I want you guys to think of me that way. I'm just making these videos because I like to read. Reading is very personal, it's very subjective, and that's the beauty of it. So the first book that I read was The Coin by Yasmin Zahar. This book follows an, I believe, unnamed woman who moves from Palestine to America because she gets a job teaching at a school for underprivileged boys. This book is pitched as being about her getting involved in a pyramid scheme, selling knockoff designer bags. That is like a very minimal part of the story. It's more so about her psychological state, spanning across various relationships and her job, and the pyramid scheme is just kind of just a very small part of the book. This to me was really giving strong like My Year of Rest and Relaxation vibes. One of those books that really just centers around a very weird but compelling main character. It's told in a vignette style, and I think to really, really great effect. Almost every single micro chapter is punchy and honest and weird, and just gives you something really strange to look at within this character. I feel like this is what the weird girl fiction genre has been craving. It felt very fresh. Sometimes it feels like books in this genre are veering towards just being gross just for shock value, rather than really zoning in on a reason to explore these oddities within a specific character. But this felt very, very fresh. This character is really defined as being obsessed with cleanliness. We get a lot of detail about her very, very obsessive and detailed hygiene routines. Even though that's just kind of one small character detail, it felt very fresh in this genre where the characters are often characterized as being incredibly gross. And so even just flipping that one key detail on its head felt like this made her a very fresh character. But she was a very fresh character in a lot of ways. Overall, I really, really enjoyed this. If you like weird girl character psychology studies where it's kind of just about one really strange person and her spiral into insanity, this is one of my favorite additions to the genre that I've read recently. Then I read Spoilt Creatures by Amy Twigg. So this follows a woman named Iris who joins a woman's commune named, I think it's Breach House. I was really interested by the setup of this. You know I love anything culty and commune-y. Found the setup really, really interesting as we explore this woman's life and everything that leads to her joining this commune, but ultimately I felt like just not enough was done with that setup. I just felt like there was a lot more potential to the premise that wasn't unpacked. I just wanted more emotion and more intensity from this, ultimately. There were some really strange, impactful moments. I didn't find those impactful moments embedded within a very impactful narrative because the majority of the book just felt like long expanses of time with very, very little tension. Ultimately, there's some great writing here on a line level and some great, great moments. I just wish that those great moments had been used to bolster a more impactful narrative that just dug a little deeper and just had more oomph to it, because outside of those kind of really shocking, intriguing moments, the book just felt a little underwhelming to me. Then I read Private Rights by Julia Armfield, who you might recognize as the author of Our Wives Under the Sea. I believe this is a retelling of King Lear. Maybe a loose retelling. We are set in a kind of surreal apocalyptic scenario of never-ending rain, to the point that the never-ending rain is starting to like reshape the world and reshape society. But that's kind of happening more so in the background. And we basically just follow 3 estranged sisters who are brought back together when their father dies. And we follow their relationships with each other as well as their individual relationships with their partners as they are brought back together and start to clean out their father's very strange glass house that he lived in. This was very atmospheric, bleak, moody. I'm really intrigued by this take on apocalyptic fiction that focuses on interpersonal relationships with a slow apocalypse just happening in the background. Even though, of course, the apocalypse happening here was kind of more of a surreal thing, it just made for a very heavily atmospheric work. So the horror and apocalyptic elements in this book are mostly in the background. The focus remains very heavily on the relationships between the sisters and their partners. All 3 sisters are queer, and so we get to follow 3 different queer relationships among these 3 sisters, and I found all of the relationships in this book really, really fascinating between the 3 sisters. Their relationships with all of their partners were very rich and very compelling, and then their father as kind of this like ghostly figurehead, kind of like a magnetism among the center of it. I gave this a 4-star rating in my notes, and I didn't note down anything negative about it. It's been a while since I read this, so I assume that just came down to like level of investment and enjoyment. This was very moody, very creepy, and a great follow-up to Our Wives Under the Sea. Then I read Winter Animals by Ashani Lewis. So this book follows a woman who encounters a group of teenage squatters, I think they're like 19, and ends up joining them. Love books about weird insular cultish dynamics and communities, so the concept of this really, really intrigued me. Unfortunately, I didn't really enjoy this book. It really fell flat for me. The concept wasn't used to say anything interesting about its themes of wealth, class, utopia, and desire, specifically queer desire, which was a fun surprise that I wasn't expecting from the summary, but nothing was really done with it. The concept was kind of just used to present these themes in a very obvious way, but there was no real development to them. There was no commentary on them. It just felt like a setup that was prime for some kind of interesting emotional or thematic development, and we just didn't get any of that. There's some really great moments to the writing and some really great interesting character moments, but overall I found the characters very underdeveloped, if not typified. The characters just felt like vehicles for ideas that weren't really unpacked. There isn't really a story or plot that we could place the characters in order to watch them make interesting decisions. Most of this book is just the characters sitting around. So basically the squatters in this book come from very wealthy backgrounds, but they've decided instead to live as squatters by staying in off-season ski resorts. I found this overall situation to be illogical, if not completely unbelievable. This is set in North America. I believe the characters are all British, as is maybe the author. As someone who has been to some of the ski resorts in question, like Banff, during the off-season, first of all, you can't ski at these resorts in the off-season because there is no snow. And second of all, most ski resorts are not closed down and empty during the off-season. They are still functioning as either hiking or bike resorts. You can still go to Banff in the summer and it's still full of people. You just go there to hike instead of to ski. That just made no sense. It's just something that I feel should have been caught in editing. So then I read a short story collection, Coexistence by Billy Ray Belcourt. He's one of my favorite authors, and I believe this is his first short story collection. This is an interlinked short story collection that follows predominantly gay Indigenous men who work in academia, not exclusively. It's kind of hard to explain why this collection is so good. I mean, obviously the writing is top-notch. Billy Ray Belcourt can write. He has an incredible poetic mind, as evidenced by everything he's ever written. But I think it's hard to explain why this is so good because the stories are so gentle, so slice of life. In many ways, when reading these stories, you forget you're reading a work of fiction. You really feel like you've just been transported to a very quiet but important, but you don't necessarily know why it's so important. It feels like you've just been transported directly into someone's life. These stories don't feel like fiction, they feel like life in a very poetic, intimate, important way. It's like you just have been given this very precious access to the vulnerabilities and intimacies of someone's life, rather than feeling like you're reading a story that's been written. The stories are very vulnerable, they're often melancholic. Most of the stories are very mellow in concept. He just has an ability to look at life so precisely with so much truth that it makes for such incredible fiction. So then I read Acts of Service by Lillian Fishman as my elective for my MFA degree. I took a class on writing sex in fiction, and we read this book in the class. So this book follows a woman named Eve. She's in a very happy, stable, long-term relationship with her girlfriend who just adores her, but she has a secret habit of posting nudes anonymously online. One day, a woman named Olivia reaches out to her, and Eve ends up meeting Olivia as well as this man named Nathan that Olivia is seeing, and starts an affair with kind of both of them, but predominantly with Nathan. I have very complicated feelings on this book. I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the complexity of the writing on the line and paragraph levels. I found the characters very interesting. I found the relationship dynamics, for the most part, quite interesting. I just really enjoyed the complexity in character on the line level. This is a really hard book to discuss because it exists in a very kind of amoral space, which is fine. And I think it's intended to be uncomfortable, which is also fine. I'm fine with both of those things. I don't mind books that are kind of detached from morality or meant to be uncomfortable. But I think it's hard to critique because everything is so ambiguous. Nothing is really unpacked on the page. So it's kind of impossible to know, like, am I critiquing this book on its level of intention or not? The dynamics we were shown, especially the dynamics between Eve and Nathan, didn't really reveal anything that interesting to me. There are angles that I can look at this book and see really interesting commentary, but there are also angles that I can look at this book and see absolutely no point to anything. And I don't know which angle the author wants me to be looking at this book. I don't know the angle the author was writing the book from. And obviously you can never tell this with any book you're reading, but this book felt like it was almost going out of its way to wash its hands of its own content by just never really taking a stance on anything whatsoever, but also trying to imply that it was a story of great depth and importance and subversiveness. Ultimately, there were just things that I really wish had been unpacked. If the book had unpacked its relationship dynamics a little bit more and just given some moment of clarity, that's what I was looking for. The whole book, I'm reading this book and I'm just asking for clarity. Not because I want the book to tell me how to feel, but because I want there to be a reason. I want there to be a point. I want there to be something that has been gleaned or uncovered. But it felt like we spent the whole book with the main character rambling about how, subversive and important and transformational this relationship with Nathan was. I can't really identify any aspect of clarity or change. I don't want the book to tell me how to feel, but I want the book have some kind of thematic arc or opening or some element of revelation or clarity. Then I read Pure Color by Sheila Heti. This is the hardest book to explain. I think I wrote it better here. I said, why did I for so long not read this? Because I thought it was just a book about a woman thinking, when actually it's about God's first draft of the universe, a woman falling in love with another woman, then becoming a consciousness inside a leaf she shares with the spirit of her deceased father. It was one of the weirdest books I've ever read. Despite its very philosophical execution, it's actually very playful and charming and quirky and trippy. Unlike Acts of Service, which I found a lot of rambling to no point, this felt very revelatory. This felt revelatory both in concept, execution, and ideas presented on the page. I think this will be a love it or hate it book, but I think if you like experimental fiction that is propelled more by idea than plot, you might love this. It's philosophical without feeling dense. Stylistically, it actually feels quite light. So I think if you want a book that's very philosophically clever and revelatory while being stylistically quite concise, I think you would really, really enjoy this. Then I read Thirst by Marina Yasuza, translated from Spanish by Heather Cleary. So this book is set in two different halves. The first follows a vampire over a very long period of time, and then the second half of the book follows a woman in present-day Buenos Aires who's caring for her terminally ill mother. This was very melancholic, very moody, and I really enjoyed this take on a vampire story that was more about the emotional core of immortality. It kind of instead used vampire lore as a way to explore themes like grief, death, and rebirth in quite a poignant way. The first part, where we're following this vampire, feels very timeless. It kind of drifts by in a way that recreates a feeling of immortality. We're both on fast forward, but also like time is moving slowly simultaneously, which I found brilliantly captured an experience of living for centuries. It covers hundreds of years in kind of a breathless manner. The narrator here is fascinating. She's kind of animalistic, powered for urges for blood that she can't control. This drives her to commit many acts of impulsive violence. It was fascinating as well as unnerving, but also a little bit kind of sorrowful and lonely because she can only connect with people momentarily, partly because she's immortal, but also partly because she tends to kill them. I found the second part of the book weaker. It was a little jarring after that jump just because the first part felt so beautifully contained and pure in a sense that opening it up didn't feel necessary in my opinion. Much of that section had no connection to the first part until the last 30 pages, and it just didn't have that etherealness that the first part had. So this book is full of violence and brutality, but despite that, it also is very poetic and quiet. It's gothic, hazy. I loved the first part, which to me didn't need anything more. Not to say I disliked the second part, but it just felt like it wasn't a required addition to that beautiful pure first part of the story. Okay, so then I read The Italy Letters by Vicky Now. So this book is an epistolary novel that takes the form of a bunch of letters that the narrator is writing to her lover, a woman in Italy. This book is very much written in a stream of consciousness. It can be hard to track the narrative in the smaller moments. The narrative all kind of starts to come together into a larger portrait of the speaker's life as you flow through it. A lot of the time we jump from paragraph to paragraph and they seem like complete non sequiturs, but the more you kind of give this book time to unveil itself, the more the pieces start to kind of find gravity and just magically fit together. Many little fascinating nuggets of ideas to kind of keep you intrigued even when maybe the plot and situation feels a little hazy. The book is quite simply just letters written by the speaker to a woman that she's in love with but cannot be with, talking about all of her life and random thoughts she has. The narrative here is very vague. It's very internal. It's just a flow of thoughts and emotions. But she's an interesting person, so it makes for an interesting read. So the last book that I have here is I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself by Mac Crane. This book is set in a alternate reality, near/diagonal future version of the United States. Rather than incarceration, people who commit crimes are given extra shadows. This story begins with the main character discovering that her newborn child has an extra shadow that the child was given upon birth because the main character's partner died in childbirth. The main character already has a shadow and knows what it feels like to go through the world with an extra shadow, and now is raising a baby who has already been given an extra shadow from birth. I found this to be a very powerful dystopia. It was chilling, but also very personal in its explorations of motherhood, grief, queerness, and their intersections. I loved the little formative shifts, like the little pop quizzes throughout. I do think that a part of the concept here kind of asks us to buy into this idea that what's happening here, giving people extra shadows, is somehow worse than the real corrupt legal system. I would argue that mass incarceration and capital punishment is worse than giving people extra shadows. So to me, this feels more like a sidestep. Rather than taking our society to the most extreme point, it feels like it's just taking it to a more symbolic level that in some ways is actually less horrific than what's happening in real life. I think because the society seems to be at a very extreme point, and for the most part, we really only look at society from this one angle, which is like the new way of handling legality and punishment. I felt like the story was kind of asking us to see this as worse than reality, when in my opinion it wasn't worse. It was just symbolic of reality. I finished reading this the same night as the US election, and it felt like the world was ending. In real life, it felt a little too timely. So that's all for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, I would love to hear what you've been reading lately, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!